She doesn't belong here. The voice rolled across the stone arena like distant thunder, low and controlled, yet powerful enough to still every whisper in the crowd as Elena Whitmore stumbled forward, her worn boots scraping against the cold, polished ground, her breath shallow, uneven, like her body hadn't decided if it was brave or terrified. And maybe it was both, because the iron trial was not meant for someone like her. Not for an Omega with trembling hands and a heart that had only ever known how to endure instead of fight. But she stepped anyway, because somewhere beyond the towering walls and the watching eyes, her little sister lay fading, each breath weaker than the last. And this impossible, forbidden trial was the only path left between life and loss. And Elena had already decided she would not lose her. Not like this. Not without trying. Not without giving everything she had left. Even if it wasn't enough. Even if everyone here already believed it wouldn't be. The murmurs rising again like a tide pressing against her back, sharp and amused. An Omega? Someone scoffed, not even bothering to lower their voice. She'll last 5 minutes. Another added, laughter slipping through the air like a blade wrapped in silk. But Elena didn't look at them. She couldn't afford to, because if she met their eyes, if she let their doubt take shape inside her, she might stop. And stopping meant going back. And going back meant watching her sister disappear one quiet breath at a time. So she kept her gaze forward, locked on the massive gates ahead, black iron etched with ancient symbols that seemed to hum with something older than fear, something deeper than choice. And for a moment, just a single fragile moment, her steps faltered, because this place felt wrong, like stepping into a story where the ending had already been written and it wasn't meant for her. But then she thought of small fingers gripping hers in the dark, of a voice barely above a whisper saying her name, and the hesitation burned away into something steadier, something sharper, determination forged not from strength but from love. And that was enough. It had to be, high above, where shadows clung to carved stone like a second skin. A figure shifted, unseen by most but not by instinct. Not by something quiet and undeniable that made Elena's chest tighten without reason, without warning, as if the air itself had changed, heavier now, charged, watching her as closely as she watched the gates. And though she didn't lift her eyes, didn't dare, she felt it, that presence, like winter pressing against her spine, cold and absolute. And still she walked, one step, then another, until she stood at the threshold where no one like her had ever stood before, where no Omega had ever chosen to stand. And the guards hesitated, just for a second, uncertainty flickering in their otherwise rigid stance, because rules were clear, traditions unbroken, but something about her, about the way she stood there, small but unyielding, made even certainty feel less certain. State your claim. One of them finally said, voice formal, distant, as if already preparing to deny her. But Elena didn't hesitate this time, didn't let fear shape her words. I'm here to take the trial, she said, her voice not loud, not perfect, but steady in the way that mattered. And the silence that followed was heavier than any laughter, because now it was real. Now she had crossed the line between doubt and defiance. And somewhere above, in the place where power sat and watched, something unseen leaned forward, attention sharpened, as if the trial had already begun the moment she chose not to turn back. The gates did not open right away, and that silence stretched long enough for doubt to creep in at the edges of Elena's thoughts, thin and persistent, like a whisper she could not quite silence, because no one moved, no one spoke, and the entire arena seemed to be holding its breath as if waiting for something unseen to decide whether she was worth acknowledging at all. And then, slowly, the iron doors groaned, not loud, not dramatic, but deliberate, the sound of something ancient waking rather than reacting, and a faint pulse of cold air slipped through the narrow gap as the gates parted just enough to reveal darkness beyond, not empty, not still, but alive in a way that made her chest tighten. Because this was not just a place, it was a threshold, and stepping through meant there was no turning back, not for her, not for anyone. Last chance. One of the guards muttered, his tone quieter now, less certain than before, as if even he was unsure what would happen next. But Elena did not answer. She could not afford to, because if she let herself think of anything beyond the next step, she might falter, and so she moved, crossing the line before fear could catch up, and the moment her foot touched the stone inside, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a door closing behind her without sound, sealing her in, and the light from the arena faded just enough to make the world feel narrower, colder, more focused on her presence within it. Her breath came slower now, measured, controlled, but her heart did not follow. It pounded hard against her ribs, each beat a reminder that she did not belong here, that every instinct she had was warning her to turn around, to run, to survive. But survival had never been the goal, not this time, not when someone else's life depended on her refusal to walk away. And as she took another step forward, the ground beneath her seemed to respond, not moving, not changing, but acknowledging, as if it recognized that she had entered willingly, and that mattered. Somehow, high above, unseen by most, the figure in the shadows straightened, his gaze fixed, unblinking, drawn to her in a way that did not make sense, because he had seen countless challengers step into this place, warriors, alphas, those who had trained their entire lives for this moment, and yet none of them had held his attention the way she did now, not because of strength, not because of power, but because she had neither and still chose to stand here, still chose to move forward. And that contradiction pressed against something deeper than curiosity, something older, something instinctive. His fingers curled slightly against the armrest of the throne, carved into the stone behind him, the faintest sign that something within him had shifted, though his expression remained unchanged, composed, distant, the way a king must always be. Below, Elena stopped as the space before her widened, the darkness thinning just enough to reveal shapes forming ahead. Not threats, not yet, but possibilities, paths that twisted and overlapped like a puzzle she had no instructions for. And for the first time since she stepped inside, uncertainty truly settled in, heavier than before, because this was where choice mattered, where direction could mean everything or nothing at all, and she did not know which way to go. She did not know what this trial would demand from her, only that it would not be simple, it would not be kind, and yet, she lifted her chin slightly, her eyes scanning the shifting space with quiet resolve, because she had not come here to understand the trial. She had come here to endure it, to survive long enough to claim what she needed. And somewhere, far above, a voice that had not spoken aloud felt the weight of that decision and did not look away. The air inside the trial shifted again, almost like a breath drawn from something vast and unseen. And the faint shapes ahead of Elena began to settle into clearer forms, not solid walls or simple paths but reflections, echoes of places she recognized yet did not expect to find here. A narrow wooden hallway, dimly lit, the scent of herbs and old blankets lingering in the air, and her steps slowed without her permission as the realization struck her chest with quiet force. This was not random. This was her past. Her memories being laid out before her like stepping stones she could not ignore, and for a moment she stood there, frozen between forward motion and the pull of something deeply familiar, because at the end of that hallway she knew exactly what she would find. She had walked it too many times to count, late nights, early mornings, carrying hope in trembling hands, and fear she never spoke out loud. And now the trial had brought it here, placed it directly in front of her ass. If asking a question she had not yet answered, her breath caught as a soft sound drifted through the space, fragile, uneven, a voice she would recognize even in silence. Elena. It whispered, weak but unmistakable, and her entire body reacted before her mind could catch up, her feet moving forward. Instinctively, drawn by that sound, by the memory of holding a hand too small and too cold, by the promise she had made without ever saying the words out loud, that she would not let go, not until she had to, not until there was no other choice. And yet something about it felt wrong. Not the voice, not the place, but the way it existed here, too perfect, too immediate, like a moment pulled from time and held still for her to see. And that hesitation returned, sharper now, because this was the trial, and nothing here was meant to comfort. Everything had a purpose. Everything tested something she might not even understand yet. Her steps slowed, then stopped, just before the doorway at the end of the hall, her fingers curling slightly at her sides as she fought the instinct to run forward, to open that door, To see her sister lying there the way she remembered, pale but breathing, waiting for her, needing her. And the thought alone was enough to make her chest tighten painfully. Because what if this was her chance? What if this was the moment where she could fix everything? Where she could stay instead of moving forward? Where she could choose not to lose her? But another voice rose beneath that thought, quieter, steadier, reminding her why she had come here in the first place, reminding her that this was not real, that this was not the answer she was searching for. And Elena closed her eyes for a brief second, drawing in a slow breath, grounding herself in the present, in the cold stone beneath her feet rather than the warmth of memory calling her back. "You are not here," she whispered, not to deny the love she felt, but to refuse the illusion being placed in front of her. And when she opened her eyes again, the hallway seemed to waver, just slightly, like an image losing its hold, and she stepped back instead of forward, choosing distance over comfort, choosing the unknown over a memory that could not save anyone. And high above, the figure watching her did not move, but something in his gaze sharpened, a recognition not of power, but of restraint, of the quiet strength it took to walk away from something that mattered more than fear itself. And as Elena turned from the doorway, the space around her shifted once more, the illusion dissolving into something colder, clearer, as if the trial had accepted her answer, at least for now, and was preparing to ask something harder next. The space did not give her time to rest, and the moment the last trace of the illusion faded, the ground beneath Elena's feet shifted again, not violently, not enough to throw her off balance, but just enough to remind her that this place was always watching, always deciding. And the open expanse before her narrowed into a single path, long and dimly lit, stretching forward like a quiet challenge that offered no explanation and no comfort. And this time there were no familiar shapes, no memories waiting to pull her back, only a silence that pressed against her ears until even the sound of her own breathing felt too loud, too exposed, and she hesitated for half a second, not because she wanted to turn back, but because this kind of emptiness felt different, heavier in a way that made her instincts sharpen rather than retreat, as if something here was not meant to distract her, but to measure her. And slowly, carefully, she began to walk again, each step deliberate, each movement controlled, her shoulders tight but her gaze steady, because she had learned already that hesitation could become a trap if she let it linger too long. And as she moved forward, the air grew colder, not sharply, not painfully, but enough that she could feel it brushing against her skin, seeping into the edges of her awareness. And then the first sound came, faint at first, almost easy to ignore, a low murmur that echoed from somewhere ahead. And she stopped, her head tilting slightly as she listened, trying to understand what it was. Voices, distant but clear enough to carry meaning. And her chest tightened again, because she recognized them, not as people she loved this time, but as something else, something sharper, harsher. "She is weak," one voice said, familiar in a way she did not want to admit. "She will never survive," another followed. And Elena's fingers curled slightly at her sides as she stepped forward again, slower now, more cautious, because she knew these words. She had heard them before, in crowded rooms, in quiet corners, spoken just loud enough for her to hear, but soft enough to pretend they were not meant for her. And as she continued down the path, the voices grew clearer, layering over each other, forming a chorus of doubt that surrounded her without showing itself. "An Omega like her has no place here. She should have stayed where she belongs. She will fail." The words pressed in from all sides, not shouted, not aggressive, but persistent, unrelenting, like a truth the world had already decided for her long before she ever stepped into this place. And for a moment, just a brief, dangerous moment, her steps slowed again, because it was not the voices themselves that threatened her. It was how easily they matched the quiet fears she had buried inside, the ones she never spoke, the ones she carried without realizing. And her breath caught slightly as she felt that doubt trying to take shape, trying to turn her forward. Motion into hesitation, into uncertainty, into something that would eventually stop her entirely if she allowed it. And her gaze dropped for a second, just long enough for that weight to settle in her chest, heavy and familiar. But then she lifted her head again, not with sudden confidence, not with defiance that erased the doubt, but with something steadier, something quieter, acceptance, because she had heard these words before. She had lived with them, and they had not stopped her then, and they would not stop her now, not when the cost of stopping was something she could not accept. Maybe I am weak, she said under her breath, her voice low but clear in the stillness, and the murmurs faltered, just slightly, as if surprised by the lack of denial. Maybe I am not meant for this, she continued, her steps steadying again as she moved forward into the sound instead of away from it. But I am still here, and that was enough, not to silence the voices completely, but to push them back, to take away their power to define her path. And as she walked, the murmurs began to fade, not disappearing entirely, but losing their hold, becoming background noise instead of direction. And high above, the figure watching her leaned forward just slightly, his gaze sharpening once more, not at her strength, but at her refusal to let weakness decide her ending. And the path ahead stretched on, waiting, as if the trial had taken note and was already preparing something deeper, something that would ask more than just endurance. The path did not end, but it changed, and Elena felt it before she saw it, the quiet pressure in the air shifting into something heavier, something that made each breath feel slightly more deliberate, as if the trial itself was drawing closer, narrowing its focus. And when the dim light ahead finally opened into a wider space, she slowed, not out of fear this time, but out of instinct, because this place felt different from everything she had passed through so far, the ground smoother, almost reflective, catching faint traces of movement that were not entirely her own. And for a moment she thought it was another illusion forming, another test meant to pull her into memory or doubt. But this was not the past, and it was not voices. It was something else, something quieter but far more unsettling, because standing in the center of that open space was a figure, still and waiting, its outline unmistakable even before her mind caught up to what she was seeing. And Elena stopped, completely, her breath catching as her gaze locked onto it, because it was her, not a reflection in the ground, not a distorted version shaped by fear, but a perfect mirror standing a few feet ahead, same posture, same worn clothes, same steady but uncertain stance. And for a second the world seemed to still around her, as if the trial itself was holding that moment in place, forcing her to see it clearly, to recognize what stood in front of her. And slowly, almost unwillingly, she took a step closer, and the figure did the same, matching her movement exactly, not a second behind, not a fraction out of sync, but perfectly aligned. And that precision sent a quiet tension through her chest, because this was not something she could outrun or ignore. This was something that required her to face it directly, and the silence between them stretched, heavy and expectant, until finally, the other Elena spoke, her voice calm, steady, and far too certain. "You should not have come here." And the words landed with a weight that felt different from the voices before, not mocking, not cruel, but honest in a way that made them harder to dismiss. Elena's fingers curled slightly at her sides, her pulse quickening, because hearing it from herself felt more real, more dangerous than anything spoken by others. And she shook her head once, a small movement but deliberate. "I had no choice," she answered, her voice quieter but no less firm, and the reflection tilted its head just slightly, studying her with an expression that mirrored her own but carried something colder beneath it, something that did not believe her. "There is always a choice," it replied. "You chose this." And the words settled deeper than she expected, because they were true. She had chosen to step forward, chosen to risk everything for something that might not even be possible. And for a moment that truth pressed against her resolve, testing it in a way that felt sharper than fear, because fear could be ignored, but truth demanded to be acknowledged. And her gaze dropped briefly, her breath unsteady for the first time since she had entered this space. And the reflection stepped closer, closing the distance just enough to make the moment feel tighter, more confined. "And what happens if you fail?" it asked, not accusing, not cruel, just certain. And Elena swallowed, her throat tightening as that question took shape in her mind, because failure here did not just mean losing. It meant going back with nothing. It meant facing the same ending she had been trying to change. And her chest rose and fell slowly as she forced herself to look up again, to meet her own gaze, to face that question without turning away. "Then I fail," she said, the words simple but heavy with everything she refused to say out loud. And the reflection watched her for a long second, silent now, as if measuring that answer, weighing it against something unseen. And then, slowly, it stepped back, its form beginning to blur at the edges, not disappearing yet, but loosening, as if the trial had heard enough, as if it had taken what it needed from her response, and the space around them shifted again, the reflective ground dimming, the air growing colder, and Elena remained where she was for a moment longer, her heart still unsteady but her stance unchanged, because whatever came next, she had already decided she would face it, even if the only thing standing in her way was herself. The space did not collapse this time. It deepened, and Elena felt it in the way the air pressed closer, heavier, as if the trial had moved beyond testing what she remembered or what she believed, and was now reaching for something beneath all of that, something she had never needed to face directly before. And as the reflection of herself faded completely, the ground beneath her feet darkened, the faint sheen disappearing until it became solid, unyielding stone again, and the silence returned. But it was no longer empty. It was waiting, and she stood there for a moment, her breath uneven from everything she had just faced, her chest tight not with fear, but with the weight of being seen too clearly, even by herself. And then a sound broke through, not a voice this time, not words, but a steady rhythm, low and distant, like a heartbeat echoing through the space itself. And Elena stilled, her head lifting slightly as she tried to locate it, her senses sharpening as the sound grew, stronger, more defined, and with each step she took forward, it seemed to align with her own pulse, matching it, then overtaking it, until it felt like the space around her was alive, aware, and focused entirely on her presence within it. And that realization sent a quiet tension through her spine, because this was not a test she could reason through. This was something instinctive, something deeper than thought. And as she moved into the next chamber, the source revealed itself not as a single object or figure, but as a presence that filled the space, invisible yet undeniable, pressing against her senses like a force she could not see but could not ignore. And her steps slowed again, not from hesitation but from the sheer intensity of it, because this felt different from everything before. This was not asking her to choose or to remember. It was asking her to endure, and the pressure built gradually, not enough to overwhelm her immediately, but enough to make each breath heavier, each movement more deliberate, as if the trial was measuring how long she could stand beneath something she did not understand. And Elena's shoulders tensed, her hands curling slightly as she fought the instinct to retreat, because every part of her was telling her to step back, to escape this invisible weight. But she forced herself to stay where she was, her feet planted firmly against the stone, her breathing slow and controlled despite the strain building in her chest. And for a moment doubt flickered again, quieter this time, but no less present, because what if this was the limit of what she could handle? What if this was where her lack of strength finally caught up to her? What if everything she had done so far was not enough to carry her through what came next? And her gaze lowered slightly as that thought took shape, pressing against her resolve. But then she closed her eyes, just briefly, grounding herself in something simple, something real, the memory of a hand in hers, small and fragile but trusting. And that was enough to steady her again, not to remove the pressure, not to make it easier, but to remind her why she was still standing here at all. And slowly, deliberately, she straightened her posture, lifting her chin just slightly as she faced the invisible force around her, not with defiance, not with strength she did not possess, but with quiet refusal to be moved. And the space responded, not with sound or sudden change, but with a subtle shift in that pressure, as if it had taken note, as if it was adjusting, testing again. And high above, the one who watched did not remain still this time, his fingers tightening slightly against the stone beside him, his gaze narrowing as something unfamiliar stirred beneath his composure, because this was not how this part of the trial usually unfolded, not for someone like her, not for an Omega who should have already reached her limit. And yet she stood, not unshaken, not unaffected, but still there, still refusing to step back. And that quiet persistence drew his attention more sharply than any display of power ever could. And as Elena remained in place, her breath steadying despite the weight pressing against her, The space seemed to hold itself in suspension, as if the trial was pausing, reconsidering, deciding what to demand from her next. The pressure did not break her, but it changed, and Elena felt the shift the way one feels a storm turning before the first drop ever falls. Subtle, yet undeniable. The weight that had been pressing down on her easing just enough to let her breathe more fully again. And for a moment she did not move, did not trust it, because nothing in this place happened without reason. Nothing gave without taking something in return, and slowly, carefully, she opened her eyes, her gaze lifting to take in the space around her as the invisible force receded, not disappearing entirely, but pulling back like a tide that had tested the shore and found it unyielding. And the silence that followed was different now, no longer heavy with expectation, but sharp with something else, anticipation. And then it came, not from the ground or the air, but from above, a presence that did not hide itself this time. A shift in the atmosphere that drew her attention upward before she could stop herself, and her breath caught as she saw him clearly for the first time. Not just a shadow, not just a distant figure watching from beyond reach, but the Alpha King himself, standing at the edge of the elevated stone platform, his posture still, composed, yet carrying a weight that filled the entire space without effort. His gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made everything else seem distant, irrelevant, and Elena felt it immediately. The difference between being observed by the trial and being seen by him. Because this was not neutral, this was not distant. This was something far more focused, far more deliberate. And her body reacted before her thoughts could catch up, her shoulders tightening, her pulse quickening as that attention settled on her like a physical force, not overwhelming but impossible to ignore. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the distance between them filled with something unspoken, something that stretched beyond the rules of the trial itself, because he was not supposed to intervene, not here, not like this. And yet he stood there, watching her as if the outcome of everything she had done so far mattered in a way it had never mattered for anyone else. And Elena swallowed, her throat tightening as she forced herself to hold his gaze, even as every instinct told her to look away, because there was something in his eyes that made it difficult to breathe, something sharp and searching, as if he was not just looking at her but through her, past every defense she had built, past every answer she had given, and into something deeper she had not meant to reveal. And the silence stretched until it became its own kind of pressure, different from before, but just as intense. And then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and controlled, carrying across the space without needing to be raised. You should not have reached this point. And the words were not an accusation, not even a judgment, but a statement of fact that hung between them with quiet weight. And Elena's breath hitched slightly, not because she disagreed, but because she knew he was right. She was not supposed to be here, not by the rules that governed everything around them, not by the expectations that had been set long before she ever stepped into this place. And yet she was, and that alone made something shift in the air between them, something unspoken but undeniable. And she straightened slightly, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. But I am, she answered, not challenging him but not backing down either, and his gaze sharpened at that, just slightly. A flicker of something unreadable passing through his expression before it settled back into calm. And for a moment it seemed as if the trial itself had paused, as if everything around them was waiting for what would happen next, not from her, but from him, because this was no longer just about endurance or choice. This was about something else entirely, something that neither of them had fully named yet. And as Elena stood there beneath his gaze, she felt it, that shift, that quiet, irreversible moment, where the trial stopped being just a test and started becoming something far more personal. The silence after her words did not break. It deepened, stretching between Elena and the Alpha King like something alive, something listening. And for a moment she wondered if she had said too much or not enough. But his expression did not change, not in any obvious way. Only that same steady gaze fixed on her, as if weighing something far beyond the simple fact that she stood there. And then he moved, not abruptly, not in a way that startled the air, but with a quiet certainty that drew every ounce of attention to him as he stepped down from the elevated platform, each movement controlled, deliberate, the distance between them closing not quickly but inevitably. And Elena felt it with every step he took, that shift in presence growing stronger, more defined, until it no longer felt like something above her, but something directly in front of her, something she could not avoid. And her breath tightened slightly as she held her ground, refusing to step back even as every instinct whispered that she should, because this was no longer just the trial. This was him, and the rules that had governed everything so far felt less certain with each step he took closer. And when he finally stopped a few feet away, the space between them felt smaller than it should have, charged with something unspoken, something that made it difficult to look anywhere else. And for a long second, he said nothing, his gaze moving over her, as if taking in every detail, not with curiosity alone but with recognition that made no sense, because they had never met, and yet something in the way he looked at her suggested otherwise, and Elena swallowed, forcing herself to remain steady under that attention, even as her pulse quickened. And then he spoke again, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. "Why?" he asked, the single word carrying more weight than any long question could have, and Elena hesitated. Not because she did not know the answer, but because saying it here, in front of him, felt different, more exposed than anything she had faced so far. But she lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady, despite the tightness in her chest. "My sister," she said simply, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, subtle but real, a flicker of something that was not indifference, not distance, but something closer to understanding, and it passed quickly, but not quickly enough to be missed, and his gaze sharpened slightly as he considered her answer, as if measuring it against something only he could see. And the silence returned for a moment, not empty this time, but filled with that quiet exchange, that recognition of motive that went deeper than the trial itself. And then he stepped closer, just enough that the distance between them became undeniable, and Elena felt her breath catch again, not from fear, but from the intensity of being this close to someone who carried so much power so effortlessly. And yet there was no thread in his movement, no force behind it, only presence. And that made it harder to understand, harder to predict. "You have endured what others could not," he said, his voice low, measured, and Elena's fingers curled slightly at her sides, not from pride but from the weight of what that meant, because endurance was not something she had ever seen as strength. It had simply been necessary, and she did not answer, did not know how to, and he watched her for another moment before his gaze shifted slightly, not away, but deeper, as if seeing something beneath her words, beneath her actions, something she had not intended to show. And when he spoke again, there was a different note in his voice, something quieter, more certain. "And yet," he continued, "you are still not free." And the words landed heavier than anything before, not because they were harsh, but because they carried a truth she had not considered until that moment. And her breath caught slightly as she processed it, because she had come here for one reason, to complete the trial and leave, to take whatever reward it offered in return. But the way he said it made something shift, something she could not fully name yet, and her gaze flickered, just briefly, as that realization took shape, and for the first time since she had stepped inside, uncertainty touched something deeper than fear, because this was no longer just about whether she could survive, it was about whether she would be allowed to leave at all. The words settled between them, and Elena felt them take root in a place deeper than thought, deeper than fear, because for the first time since she had stepped into the trial, the path forward was no longer clear, no longer something she could define simply by enduring what came next. And her breath slowed, uneven at first before she forced it steady again, her gaze lifting to meet his fully, because if there was uncertainty now, she would face it the same way she had faced everything else. Without turning away, "I did not come here to stay," she said, her voice quiet but firm. And the moment the words left her, the air shifted again, not violently, not with force, but with a subtle tension that seemed to ripple outward, as if the trial itself had heard her declaration and was waiting for what would follow. And the Alpha King did not step back, did not break that space between them, his presence unwavering as he studied her. And for a long second there was no response, no immediate answer to her claim. Only that same steady gaze that made it feel as though he was considering not just her words but everything that had led her to them. And then, slowly, he shook his head once, the motion small but final. "You misunderstand," he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying something that could not be ignored, and Elena's chest tightened slightly at the shift in tone, because there was no anger there, no threat, only certainty, and that made it harder to challenge, harder to resist. The trial does not end when you decide it should, he continued, and his gaze did not leave hers. It ends when it chooses. And the words landed with quiet weight, not dramatic, not harsh, but absolute. And Elena felt that truth settle around her, not just from him, but from the space itself, from everything she had experienced since stepping through those gates. Because nothing here had followed her expectations, nothing had bent to her will, and yet she had kept moving forward, believing that there would be an end she could reach, a point where she could leave with what she needed. And now that belief wavered, not breaking, but shifting into something less certain. And her fingers curled slightly at her sides as she processed it, as she felt the shape of that possibility forming, that she might not walk out of here the way she had intended, that the cost of stepping forward might be something she had not fully understood when she made that choice. And for a moment silence filled the space again, but it was no longer empty. It was heavy with everything unspoken, everything that could not be undone. And then she took a breath, slow and deliberate, grounding herself in the one thing that had carried her this far, purpose. And when she spoke again, her voice was steadier, not because the uncertainty had vanished, but because she had chosen to stand within it anyway. Then let it choose, she said, and the words were not defiance, not a challenge thrown carelessly into the air, but acceptance of what she could not control. And the moment they left her, something shifted, deeper than before, the space around them responding in a way that was almost imperceptible yet undeniable, as if the trial itself had been waiting for that answer, waiting for her to stop trying to shape its outcome, and instead face it as it was. And the Alpha King watched her closely, his gaze sharpening once more, not with surprise, but with something closer to recognition, as if he had been expecting something less and had been given something more. And for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, not a bond, not yet, but the beginning of one, something fragile and undefined that neither of them named. And then the air grew still again, settling into a quiet that felt final in a way nothing else had. And somewhere beyond the visible space, beyond the stone and silence, something shifted, a door unseen beginning to close, not with sound, not with movement she could follow, but with certainty. And Elena felt it, deep in her chest, that subtle but undeniable realization that whatever came next, whatever the trial demanded from her, the path behind her was no longer open. And for the first time since she had stepped inside, the thought took shape clearly, fully, and without a